Joseph Salmon, I'm the chair of the next nature. We hope it's not going to be too hot. Hopefully you had a bit of cold beverage for lunch. Right now it's my great pleasure to welcome an Irishman, Oisin. So it's very hard to pronounce his name. I had to ask many times. He's coming from Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And he has worked in computer vision, machine learning, and today he's going to present some work on fine-grained knowledge discovery from images. So it's mostly connected to application of ecological, earth science, this kind of things. So I think it's going to be interesting for both communities here. The stage is yours, often for 45 minutes. I'll try to show you when it's the last 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So you might have noticed it's very hot at the moment, but not in Edinburgh actually. So if you want to break, go to Edinburgh. But this extreme heat or these extreme climate events that we're experiencing, it's a problem clearly for humans. We have ways to adapt to it. But the species of animals, plants and animals that we share the natural world with, they don't have that same ability to kind of escape in the ways that we do. And so these extreme climate events, heat waves, wildfires, droughts, floods, they heavily impact the natural world. And this is important to us because biodiversity is fundamentally important. So biodiversity, or the biological diversity of life on Earth, it affords us things like materials, foods, fuels, gives us ways to regulate the climate, allows the supporting of processes to purify water, it gives us opportunities to go out and enjoy nature. So these are kind of crucial ecosystem services that we benefit and really need. But the problem is, biodiversity is in dramatic decline. So you might have seen plots like these, they very regularly feature in the news and in the media. So this is the Living Planet Index, and so in the last 50 years, the Living Planet Index, one measure of abundance of species, has observed this 75 or 73% decline over that period of time. So this is a dramatic decline that's driven by things like climate change, land use change, human events, and so on, or human interventions. And so why am I talking about this here? I'm talking about it because there's a huge opportunity, I feel, and obviously I'm not the only one who thinks this, for computer vision and machine learning to actually help some of these problems, help some of these challenges. And that is kind of a multifaceted set of things that could be done. So at the core level, there's questions around sensing or monitoring. We need to be able to understand what populations are out there, how those populations of species are changing over time, and crucially we need scalable, affordable, cost-effective ways to actually do this. And now we have these amazing technological innovations, different sensing platforms like remote sensing imagery from satellite, drones, we've got cameras, we've got audio devices, we've got citizen science applications that's collecting raw data, and so we have an opportunity to develop methods that can turn that raw data into some kind of semantically actionable information that scientists can work with. There's another whole part of this puzzle which I think resonates much more with machine learning, which is questions around forecasting, predicting change. So we have these highly complex, nonlinear, stochastic systems with lots of complex interactions with limited data, and we need to be able to understand how that's going to change over time and how that's going to change in the face of climate change, how that's going to face change in the face of local changes like land use changes and so on. So there's really interesting, complex prediction tasks there. And the one potentially good piece of news in all of these negative news is that we're seeing this amazing growth in biodiversity data. So this is in large part thanks to citizen science efforts. So there's platforms like iNaturalist, PlantNet, obviously based here in Montpellier, eBird. See, these are ways in which the public are going out, collecting data about the natural world, and that's feeding its way back into science, and ultimately and hopefully that's feeding its way back into kind of policy and changes. And what's quite cool, so GBIF, this is an aggregator of lots of different sources of data. And over the last 10 years, we've seen something nearly like a 5-fold increase in the amount of data about the natural world that's been collected. So that's kind of now approaching kind of 4 billion occurrences. So occurrence, you could think of this as an observation someone's made out in the wild, like a documentation of a specific species being in a specific place at a specific time. So this is a dramatic increase, and that's really driven by all of these amazing citizen science endeavors. And one such project is iNaturalist. So this is a group that we collaborate with quite closely in my research group. iNaturalist is a platform where members of the public go out, they document nature, and so this kind of heat map that you see up on the screen represents the kind of places where people are collecting data. So you can see it's pretty globally distributed. And they've collected about 300 million observations of over 500,000 species spanning all taxa or all forms of life. And that's been done by nearly 4 million people around the world. So it's a pretty cool and impressive project. And if you zoom right into the university here, you get a sense of kind of the density of observations. And so one observation is basically a photograph in the context of iNaturalist. It's a photograph, a place, and a time, and a person that took that photograph. And the cool thing about these platforms is they separate out observation, so collecting data, and identification, deciding what's in that observation. So you don't need to be an expert to collect the data, you can share it with people online and they can help each other identify what's present. And from a computer vision point of view, it's this really fascinating, exciting, visual diversity of data. You know, if you're sick of looking at ImageNet images, these are great images to look at because there's just a lot of wealth of complexity, there's a lot of visual diversity present there. It's images spanning, again, you know, mammals, birds, plants, etc. And so over the years, we've worked with iNaturalist closely to kind of try and, let's say, compartmentalize challenges or create benchmarks from this data that we can make accessible to the computer vision research community so that they can use these for driving methodological development. So think of this as kind of like alternative benchmarks, things like ImageNet. These data sets allow us kind of a different lens or a different way to assess performance of models. And the data is challenging for several reasons, and some of these are going to be pretty obvious, but it's kind of worth emphasizing just because I think it can be striking how difficult some of these problems are. So you've got challenges like high inter-class variation. So the same class, the same concept, a species like a marble salamander can be depicted as a juvenile here on the left, all the way up to an adult, and huge visual diversity. You've got low interclass variation, so you can have these fine-grained visual classification problems, two species that are completely different species but actually look highly similar, and only possible to tell the difference between if you know that the wing bands here connect on this on the back of the species. And these are like best case scenario easy images. The other challenge is imbalanced data. Okay, so we've got a small number of species that are super common all around the world, and we've got loads of observations, like a duck and mallard. At the other end of the spectrum, we have lots of species. So we've got a log axis here. So lots of species where we have very little observations. So this huge long tail of data where the most things are basically observed only a small amount of time, and many things have not even actually been documented or photographed yet. And one of the other major challenges that makes scientific inference challenging from these data sets is that we've got huge spatial and temporal biases. So this is a map of biodiversity, mammal biodiversity on the planet. You can see this big concentration around the equator. This is where data comes in on a platform like iNaturalist, and it's nearly like the flip. It's like a mirror image of it. So we have this massive concentration to the global north, and actually those are the places that are much less biodiverse than the place that we'd actually like to monitor. Okay, so beyond classification tasks, which will be kind of mainly my focus today, or variants of classification tasks, there's also a lot of other cool opportunities, a lot of other questions that can be explored in these data sets. And these are kinds of things that we also do in my research group, but it's not stuff that I'm going to talk about today. But these are questions like 2D to 3D understanding, these highly deformable articulated objects, really hard to model in 3D. Machine teaching, so teaching humans with machines rather than using machines to teach humans. Model differencing, using fine-grained data to understand fine-grained representational differences that are encoded in two different models, maybe even trained on similar data. So how do we kind of understand what it is that model A has learned that model B is not able to learn? There's core questions around representation learning. How do we actually learn representations in such complex fine-grained data that's actually useful? And that's still actually a big open question, even though we've made a lot of progress on much more common everyday visual data sets. And spatial distribution modeling. So modeling the actual spatial distribution of these species so we can turn these raw occurrences into actual maps that are useful for scientists. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 3 broad projects, and they all kind of fall into this theme of how can we efficiently and robustly explore large fine-grained image collections to extract new scientific insights. At least that's the hope of what we're aiming to do. And I'm going to talk about work in fine-grained image retrieval, text-guided clustering, and autonomous discovery as well. So let me start with fine-grained retrieval. So this is actually kind of quite a fun headline from the New York Times from several years ago, and this actually motivated the early work in this project. So the thing we observed was that, yes, understanding what species are in these images is important. That's kind of like your basic level of understanding. But there's a whole massive long tail of interesting visual questions that people want to answer. So that's things like the mating behavior of the southern alligator lizard, which turns out to be slightly unusual. And so the experts that had been exploring this project, so these were people at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, they had never actually observed this behavior in the wild themselves, even though they studied this organism. They went on to a naturalist and they found 150 occurrences of this particular behavior. So this was a really cool example of separating out observation from kind of scientific inference. And so we started thinking, well, this is just one example of a kind of complex, fine-grained visual question that someone might want to ask of these big data sets. There's no way we can build a classifier for every one of those. Is there a way that we can kind of scalably do this? And crucially, is there a way that we can scalably evaluate models' ability to do it? So again, the kind of problem setting is we've got a huge data set, millions of images, we've got some experts, they've got a question, how are bird diets changing? And what would they do traditionally? I suppose they would manually check every image. That's going to take 4,000 days for one query, so obviously not very scalable. Maybe they could run a classifier to first select bird images and then manually check those. Great, we've dropped it down to maybe 500 days, clearly not very scalable. So the question really is, how can we automate this process? And really the question, more refined version of it is, can vision language models actually do this task at all? So what's possible right now, the text might be a bit hard to read, but what we're seeing here is someone typing the name of a species. And because we've got good classifiers, because people have already identified some of those images, you can actually return relevant images for your query. That's kind of possible already. That's not too exciting, really commodified stuff. But what if you had a really niche query, like California condor with the green tag with number 26 on its wing? So this is kind of a compound, quite niche query. There's no classifier directly available for this. Or maybe you're interested in primates eating junk food. Again, probably not a classifier directly for that. And so as I motivated this, there's this huge long tail of these visual knowledge questions that people want to answer. Things like hermit crabs using plastic wastes as their shells, or wild animals walking on man-made roads. So we developed a benchmark. You could think of this as kind of a vision language extension of some of the work I mentioned earlier on, where we have a large number of queries. And so for each query, like the hermit crab using plastic waste as its shell, we've exhaustively annotated 5 million images to say whether that particular visual signal is present or not in the data. So while the number of queries is small, 250, actually the number of matched images for those overall is huge because we've exhaustively labeled it. And then these types of questions, we interacted with ecologists, we interacted with the ecological literature to try and get good coverage over the types of questions that are involved in the data sets. So these are things that span ID questions, context, interactions, behavior, appearance, and so on. And then they span the kind of taxonomic tree of life, so it's not just limited to one kind of coarse set of organisms. And so the dataset represents 2 tasks. So one is a retrieval challenge. So again, you've got a query, you search for that query in the large dataset, and then you score points if you return relevant images to that query. And then there's a re-ranking challenge. So we give you a subset of images, and you have to reorder, re-rank those to find the ones that are relevant for the query. All right. I think many people are probably familiar with clip style models. We're going to focus the evaluation primarily on clip style models because they allow us to nicely decouple the encoding of images from the encoding of the text query, and so that we can really efficiently, on the order of a kind of less than a second, query a large data set of several tens of millions of images. Okay, so I'll talk through some of the results. Some of these are maybe not so surprising, some of them are potentially non-intuitive. So model performance improves as we improve the size of the base model. So this is kind of a good thing. This is what we often see in machine learning settings. But we have these diminishing returns. So basically performance kind of plateaus. As we look at computation here on the x-axis and performance on the y-axis, we see this leveling off of performance. So this is like not really much point in using much larger models in this setting. What's interesting is training data has a significant impact, but it's not what you might think. So more biological focused data sets like BioClip and so on actually tend to do worse overall. They might be quite good on species, but they do worse overall. But more general purpose data sets like the DFN corpus that's used to train SIGLIP, that actually works quite well. And to give some insight into where these models fail, so they don't really handle these fine-grained compositional queries. So this example of the California condor with the green 26. So you can see it pulls up images with tagged birds, they're just not the right number. And then they fail to kind of handle this, let's say, more specific domain knowledge. So this particular type of feeding behavior of this bird. It doesn't find relevant images. And you could argue, okay, well that's a kind of a niche query, that's not very relevant to kind of everyday text. But actually, birds are not so, uncommon. This is the kind of stuff that you would expect to be readily available on the internet, especially if these large models are trained on huge amounts of data. But what we can do is we can combine these cheap clip-style models with much more expensive vision language models to kind of re-rank images. So we can use clip to generate a bunch of retrieved examples. Then we can ask a more expensive large multimodal model to re-rank them. And then we get a re-ranked set of candidate images. And so you can see on the left is clips, initial ranking, and then the re-ranking based on using a larger vision language model. And you get the kind of best of both worlds. You get the accuracy of the expensive model, but you get the speed of the cheaper one. And just to emphasize that, so clip will take about a minute to query an image. Doing LLM querying on all images is going to take you multiple days, but you can do something on the order of minutes or two just combining them. And then you can see that translated to quantitative improvements in performance. Okay, so that's the Inquire benchmark. It's kind of our attempt to move beyond more conventional image classification tasks into something that's much more open-ended and representative of the kind of long-tail questions that people, I think, want to answer in real life. We started deploying this at scale now with a kind of a test group of ecologists. And so, for example, we have a tool where they can search on the order of tens of millions of images. And what's been quite fun for this is we've gotten them to see if they can recreate analysis that's happened in existing papers. So for example, there'll be a paper that has documented seasonal variation in bird diets. And that is represented there in the blue bars in these plots. So these are showing you different foods that different species of birds eat. And in red is the results coming from the tool, the search tool that we have. And you can see that it's a really good match for what's in the paper, and this is performed at a fraction of the time that would be previously required. And another example of the kind of flowering behavior of a particular set of plants. Okay, so text-based retrieval of fine-grained visual concepts, still really difficult. I think there's a lot of cool stuff to be done there. These bigger models work better, but actually they don't really solve the problem. And we haven't really observed a dramatic improvement on kind of newer models that we've evaluated subsequently. There's ways to combine models together, but these are not, it's not the most elegant solution, so I think there's opportunities for thinking about how to inject problem-specific knowledge into pre-trained models. But the cool thing is I think that there's an opportunity here for actually translating this into tools that people can use and actually do interesting science with. Okay, so let me switch gears a bit to talk about some work we've been doing on text-guided clustering. So the core question here really is, can we actually discover structure in unlabeled data using minimal supervision? We have these huge data sets. Can we actually allow users to kind of search and find structures, clusters, groupings with actual minimal supervision that to provide the model? Like, we want to move away from this paradigm of people having to train lots or label lots of images. What's the problem? The problem is clustering, it's heavily ill-defined. So we've got an image data set here. Let's say we've got millions of images, for example, and each point here represents a different image. But there's many different ways you could group this data together. So, it could be based on the species, European versus American robin. It could be based on the visual signal, whether it's on the branch or whether it's on the ground. And the problem is clustering will just, be influenced by the specific representation that you use, and as a result, will only give you one output if you just ran some off-the-shelf unsupervised clustering method. There are techniques in the literature to try and address this problem. So maybe some of you have heard of category discovery as a problem. So the goal here is you provide a minimal number of supervised examples, tell the model something about the kind of metric, the visual metric that you care about, and then the model goes and learns a representation that can be clustered into existing things or brand new concepts that it's never seen before. There's multi-criteria clustering. So this is kind of like, unsupervised clustering with random restarts. It's a kind of a coarse simplification of it, but it gives you diverse clusterings of the data without any supervision. But we've been working on this kind of newer framing of the problem, which is called text-guided clustering. And it's quite intuitive. So the idea is that you get the user to specify the visual criteria they care about. So they might care about grouping the images into bird species. You don't ask them to specify which species they care about, because they might not know, or it might be undiscovered species that have never been documented before. But they tell you the criteria, and the model now has to try and group the unlabeled data into plausible individual species based on their criteria. Okay, and so let me kind of outline at a high level the method that we've developed. So the user specifies the visual criteria they care about. Okay, so here they're just saying the high level concept of bird is what I care about, bird species, and they're not specifying the specific classes. Okay, so now we have a model that's going to think about interpretable concepts that could be used to actually represent different bird species. And the way that this works, and I'll go into more detail later, it iteratively proposes different visual concepts that might be useful for this task. And in an unsupervised way, it gets signal as to which concepts are useful and which ones are not. And after successive iterations, the objective is that it ends up with a better representation space such that you can then do simple clustering in that space to get a final set of output classes. So the cool thing about this is you end up with a kind of minimal supervision and an interpretable representation space to actually do it. Okay, so in a bit more detail, the setting is user provides a criteria, we have a huge unlabeled image data set. There's a concept generator. There's no need to read this prompt, but you could just think of this as a language model that's been told to generate a set of attribute and value pairs, like color, red, and the idea is that these attributes should be useful for the specific task that the model is asked to be done. And this is just an off-the-shelf language model that's prompted to do this. Then we can take each of those concepts, we can use a pre-trained vision language model, and we can score the presence of each concept in each image. So then you can think of it as, for each image we now have a feature vector, which is a score telling you a probability of the presence of a specific visual concept from our set of concepts up here. We can then cluster them, just using some unsupervised clustering method, and we'll get a score. And so that score is think of it something like a silhouette score, some kind of unsupervised clustering metric. So the more cluster-like the data is, the better the score. And the worse, or the less cluster-like it is, the worse the score. And then over successive iterative rounds, the model or the concept generator is basically proposing new updated concepts with the idea of driving the score as high as possible. So it wants to generate concepts that can cluster the data better. And in doing that, or to do that, it gets access to its past history of the concepts that it's proposed. Okay, and so then the nice thing about this is the actual concepts that come out of this end up being kind of super interpretable. So we have something like, eye shape ring. wing pattern bar, and then we get a score. So what I'm showing you here is a subset of the total number of concepts, just the ones that are activated highly for this given image. And you can see other examples. Again, you don't need to look at all these, but we've got wing shape long. So for each image, we've got a huge set of concepts, and we've got a score for each of them. And you can see that they're actually kind of sensible, wing color, orange, and so on. We can compare our approach to existing techniques. So this is comparing to clip style models, category discovery, previous examples of text-guided clustering in the literature, and you can see our approach here. We get this nice boost in performance. Even when you consider something like CLIP or SimGCD, they actually get access to additional supervision that our model doesn't get. Okay, so that was a bit of a rapid tour of text-guided clustering or text-guided discovery, but I think there's a huge opportunity here for thinking about minimal supervision interactions with users to actually extract structure from our data. And we can kind of avail of the fact that we now have these pretty effective large language models that can propose plausible candidate sets of things to be able to create feature spaces that are actually useful. So again, the user only needs to provide the high level visual criteria that they care about, and that's it. But obviously a bit of the elephant in the room here is that it's only as good as the suggested concepts. But again, you can think of ways of maybe having the user more involved to propose more useful concepts for the problem. But crucially, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge, is it's limited then by our ability to ground these concepts in images. So you can come up with very niche, specific concepts that might be very informative for a specific task, but you need to be able to actually score each image for the presence of that concept. And so I think there's some interesting opportunities for thinking about decomposing concepts even further down. So we might not know the technical name for something, but maybe we can describe it in terms of its shape or its appearance and so on. Okay, so let me switch gears again to the final main project that I want to talk about. And that's some work that we've just put online on Archive about autonomous discovery. I'll explain what this means. Okay, so the first part of the talk, I talked about this setting where we have a user with some specific, interesting scientific question in mind, and now they have this like new paradigm for search. They can go and dip into the large quantity of data that's out there, and they can do their experiments kind of, virtually rather than having to do it in the field, or at least some of their experiments. But the question we're interested in exploring here is, to what extent could some kind of discovery agent assist even further? So can we imagine a scenario where the agent is proposing hypotheses to test itself? So we're not relying on the user, the domain expert here to do it, not because we don't value their input, but it's because we want to maybe exploit some of the strengths that these types of models could have. Conceivably, a discovery agent could draw connections to things that we've never thought about before. They could, make inference across species in this case that humans wouldn't have thought about because they might not be experts in all these different fields. And so the interaction we envisage here is that instead of the domain expert being the one proposing the ideas, they're the ones that kind of at a high level potentially guide the models by giving it specific data. But they're also there for kind of guidance or quality assurance at the end to make sure that the outputs of this process is actually sensible. Okay, and really the question is, can we automate the scientific fine-grained visual discovery? Okay, so there's a huge literature in some sense on causal discovery, structured learning, so there's a whole set of really important work on this topic, kind of finding causal links, finding links on graphs. There's been a more recent trend, represented by this paper, of trying to inject LLMs into that process to get over the limitations of conventional causal methods where you just have a predefined set of variables that the model knows about, and then maybe there's very simple links that could be inferred, maybe kind of pairwise interactions. These LLM-based causal methods, they try and allow an LLM or a model to basically propose even more complex interactions. The other complementary side of this is this work on kind of very loosely called AI scientists. So these are models that themselves try and propose experiments, run experiments, validate their outputs. And there's been a whole bunch of kind of initial work in this topic, and that includes work that, for example, might try and develop a new model directly. So improve an LLM, given some initial code, run the experiment end to end. It could be settings, and more commonly settings, where an initial hypothesis is provided to the model, and it just has to go and find the data itself to validate that hypothesis and so on. So I guess at a high level, to kind of caricature this work, what there tends not to be, is a lot of work that's looked at how these models could interact with large image collections. And there's not a lot of work on models that actually start with very limited to no prior knowledge about this specific domain itself. So that's the question we're interested in. Can we develop a fine-grained visual discovery AI agent that can take images as input and propose plausible hypotheses and test them itself? Okay, so just repeating that, we want to take multimodal data as input, minimal to no prior knowledge about that data. We want to automatically generate hypotheses and corresponding code to validate them, and I'll go into this in more detail. We want to test the hypotheses and select the ones that are supported by the actual data that we have. Okay, so this is the paper that we've just finished working on. The model's called DiscoPer, and the setting here is that we have, again, some image data set. So it could be, I'll use the biodiversity example as another example, but it could be some large collection of images. And optionally, we also could have additional metadata. So in this case, the metadata is information about what species is in the image, but also, again, the location and time and so on where the image was taken. So the usual metadata that's available for these kind of citizen science projects. Okay, and so the way that the model works is this iterative discovery process. So it's going to propose hypotheses, evaluate them, reflect on what it's discovered, and then go back and propose more. So you have this kind of cyclical process where it iteratively improves its outputs over time. And then the output is a kind of, let's call it like a validated discovery, or a pattern it's observed about the data. So it observes some insight, and crucially that insight is backed by data, and there is some statistical significance associated with the specific observation or insight that is discovered. Okay, so to give an example of what this looks like in practice, again, we start with our data set. Now we have a model that proposes a hypothesis. So again, this is an LLM agent, generates a hypothesis about the data, and that hypothesis is going to come in the form of a piece of text and an associated code with it as well. So maybe the hypothesis is that, fungi have more northern distribution than plants on average. I'm just making that example up. But again, crucially, it's something that can be tested in the data. Then the evaluation step is going to take that hypothesis and the associated code. It has the ability to run tools, and so those tools could be running vision language models to actually query what else is in the image, not just the species. It could say something about the habitat, for example. And then crucially what it does is it splits up the data that it has selected. It actually runs the code, evaluates it, it can even improve the code, then it runs a statistical test to validate the significance of it, and then a hypothesis, if it actually has passed the significance test on the validation and test set, that falls into this pool of validated claims or validated outputs, or otherwise it falls into this rejected claims, so something that hasn't passed the test. So you can think of this at a high level. It's kind of maybe in some sense, what a scientist would be doing at a very coarse level. And then what's kind of the main contribution of this work is this reflection module at the end. Okay, so this reflection module, it's going to take this set of validated claims, what was supported, what was not supported. It's going to analyze those claims. And again, this is just another LLM agent. It's going to look for gaps, look for confounds, or maybe even compound queries. So basically looking at this at a slightly higher level to understand what relationships are there between existing validated claims, with the idea of driving the model to kind of to propose things that are not just more of the same, but actually to try and push it towards parts of the hypothesis space that it hasn't looked at already. And so the way that works is there's a kind of a synthesis of these outputs that's just guidance that feeds back into this proposal claim. So again, in the interest of time, I guess I don't have time to go into a lot of the details, but this looks maybe slightly complex, but in practice this is all quite straightforward. This is an LLM with a specific prompt that generates hypotheses. There's some kind of scaffolding around here to make sure these experiments are possible to run. And then there's a kind of another LLM here that takes these inputs in the form of text and numerical outputs for the scores of the claims, of the hypotheses, and synthesizes that down into to guidance for future iteration. Okay, so the challenge here is how do you even go about evaluating such an open-ended discovery model like this? We want this to be truly open-ended in the sense that we don't want to prompt it about specific queries and see if it can actually discover those queries in the data, because that would be quite easy. What we want to have is a kind of held-out set of validated claims that we know to be true, or at least supported by evidence from the literature, and we want to see if the model can actually propose those hypotheses. Unprompted, could the model propose things that are consistent with what we know already? And can we actually then check that those proposals it makes are actually supported by evidence? So what we did is we amassed this data set. So we took 50,000 images from iNaturalist of a subset of species. And then what we did was we went to the literature and we found kind of, let's call them like 12 ecological patterns or 12 ecological validated hypotheses. I think there's an example here. So, the example might be something about the specific migration pattern of a monarch butterfly. And so again, at evaluation time, the goal is to see if the model can actually surface hypotheses like these. And so the evaluation metrics is the recall. So again, the model's ability to discover patterns from the peer-reviewed associations that we have in our data without showing them that data. And then crucially, we want a high support rate. So we want these hypotheses to actually be supported by held-out validation that the model has run. And you can see there's a kind of attention here because the model could generate totally trivial hypotheses, maybe like birds fly, and that will be supported quite highly. And so there's a kind of a big evaluation question, which I'll touch on at the end of this talk. And then again, we need an automated way to evaluate this, and so there isn't really a better solution at the moment than using kind of an LLM as a judge. So the model will spit out a bunch of hypotheses with the associated statistical tests, and then the LLM judge will match those hypotheses against what's in the evaluation data set and give it a score whether it's found something or not. Okay, so I won't dwell on this in too much detail, but this is an example of the kind of hypothesis that the model has discovered. So it's discovered something about the types of habitats that mammals are in, and that there's stronger seasonal shifts for mammals compared to other species. And in doing this, it actually had to query a vision language model to assess something about the habitat in the image. So it's not just something you could directly read from the tabular data. Here's another example of a hypothesis about the ecological niches that fungi occupy compared to flowering plants. And another example about the geographic range of larger mammals compared to that of plants. Okay, and using the data sets I just outlined, we can actually quantitatively evaluate the model, so we can measure again the recall of the model, so its ability to find these patterns that are in this held out data. And we can compare it to some existing AI scientist agents, which kind of lack some of this reflection or ability to kind of synthesize its outputs that our model does. And we can compare it to kind of more traditional causal methods, so that required a bit of work to try and turn this into a problem those methods could work with. But we see here that we have a stronger performance, and that also this additional reflection module at the end significantly boosts our recall and support rate. Okay, so here's a plot which is maybe not so surprising. So what we're doing here is varying the data that it can search, the model can search, and then we can look at the recall and we can look at the support rate. And unsurprisingly, the more data that it gets, the more kind of evidence or support there is to back up a particular hypothesis. So we kind of get this behavior that there's more data available, the support rate in general is better, and the recall is better. Not so surprising. Oops, wrong way. What's potentially more interesting, I think, is this plot. So we're varying the number of iterations. So the model just iterates many times, generating different hypotheses. And so that's what we're varying here. So again, if you look at recall, that's improving. So again, that's kind of what you would hope. The longer the model thinks, or the more it generates, the more likely it's going to find things that are relevant to the query. But what's interesting here is the support rate drops. So again, remember the support rate is how well backed a particular hypothesis that the model makes is backed in evidence. And so one interpretation of this could be that the model starts out slightly conservative, maybe supporting things that are trivial to validate in the data, and over time it actually somehow starts doing kind of riskier things or things that are kind of more non-obvious, and that kind of exploratory behavior is what you would actually want if you really want to discover non-obvious things. There's a good question around, well, is this model just remembering what the LLM has been trained on and actually just regurgitating that information? So, we're using these LLMs as kind of key components in our model, and they could just have easily have ingested that academic literature and they could just spit out these observations, even if it's held out. And I won't go into in too much detail here, but Bing Chen, who was the student who led this work, he did this quite nice experiment where he basically set up this counterfactual evaluation. So he intentionally broke known ecological relationships, like the fact that birds might migrate or the specific distribution of biodiversity in the data. So he kept the images the same, but he messed with the tabular data to kind of introduce counterfactuals. And so what happens then is the model is able to reject some of these hypotheses that it makes because there is no evidence to actually back or support these claims, even though they would be sensible in the real world. They're just not supported by the data. And again, I won't, in the interest of time, I'll probably just skip over this. What we observe here is that if you focus on the blue line versus the dashed line, basically our reflection model, the reflection module results in more hypotheses that are supported, but also it's that they're supported by the evidence of the data that's available. Okay, and again, another thing that we thought was quite interesting was trying to understand a bit about the nature of the types of hypotheses that are actually generated. So maybe more traditional, kind of simple graph-based relationships. These types of methods will find kind of pairwise associations between things. And this is what we're evaluating here, is the kind of at a course level, the types of relationships between variables that are observed. And we see kind of more non-trivial interactions being proposed from the model with this additional reflection step, which is the darker color compared to the model without. Okay, so what are the limitations? One of the obvious ones is, this is not like a silver bullet. These models can't make discoveries that are not supported by the data. And that's a big problem when we think about the spatial biases, temporal biases, and the citizen science data that I mentioned at the very start. So this data is not representative truly of the distributions of real ecological data. We're relying on an LLM as a judge to actually score performance. That has its weaknesses, but another part of this as well is that data weakness is that the model could be proposing totally valid and interesting hypotheses, but if they're not in our evaluation data, it's not getting a point for recalling that. So we don't really have a way right now to think about truly open-ended evaluation of such models. And one of the things that's kind of, I think, it's a known problem in the literature in this space is that this hypothesis generation, or how good your hypothesis generation, is the key limiting factor. What we observe in the initial iteration phase of the model, it starts riffing on very simple observations or simple associations and applying them to different species. So it might say something about birds and then use the exact same relationship for some type of species of plant. So we need better ways to kind of have these models generate creative outputs. And I guess all of us that have worked or used LLMs know that often this kind of creative output or enabling them to do things that are kind of beyond what they've seen in their training data sets are the limiting factors of these models. Okay, but to wrap this up, I introduced some work there where we're doing open-ended hypothesis proposal and evaluation for multimodal data. We can make inference, or in the paper we also show experiments where we can demonstrate that we're making inference beyond the kind of knowledge that's encoded inside of the constituent LLMs, which is an important part of this. And then, crucially, this reflection component helps the model actually kind of identify gaps and compounds deriving from the hypotheses that it makes. Okay, so I talked about 3 pieces of work here on fine-grained retrieval, text-guided clustering, and autonomous discovery. At a high level, I'm slightly biased because it's the area I work in, but I think there's many interesting and open computer vision and machine learning questions that are in this field. And really, what I talked about today was kind of just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much amazing and interesting work out there done by other people. I think what's really exciting about this is it's moving beyond kind of artificial domains that we've traditionally worked with in computer vision and to some extent machine learning. But there's this big opportunity to interact with the actual domain scientists. These are pressing real-world problems. We need to be able to kind of give plausible insight into the kinds of interventions that we should be doing in future. And one part of that puzzle is understanding what's happening right now in the natural world. So there's just really this opportunity to support new scientific understanding of the natural world. But clearly these fine-grained concepts, they really push the limits of what current models can do, and I think that should be hopefully an exciting thing, because it means that there's lots more opportunities for future work. So big thanks to my collaborators. So those include everyone here and some others not listed, but Bing Chen, one of the students who led most of the work, and there's Julia and Rupa from Sarah Beery's group, and Eddie and Omiros, who did some of the work on Inquire and Inquire Search. And so those are really the people who are responsible for doing all of the hard work. References, you can find them on my webpage, and do come talk to me if you're interested in any of these questions. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for a bunch of questions, if there are some.
Thanks, Oisin, for your great presentation. I have a question about your work on the text-guided clustering. What would you say is a current bottleneck or the future work that you can do on that? Is it related to the expressivity of the LLM, the quality of the representation of the image encoder, or even in the clustering algorithm that you're using?
Yeah, great question. I think it's exactly all of those three things. So, I think this is quite a powerful mechanism for allowing people to explore structured data. But let's say you've got some completely unusual modality. Maybe you've got some genetic data, you've got something else. So it really relies on having some kind of jointly entrained text encoder and modality encoder. So that's one of the big limiting factors. Images, it's kind of okay. But then when we get to images, I think the real challenge then is some of the stuff you mentioned and I alluded to. We know these models are not fantastic at actually reliably and robustly identifying really subtle visual concepts. It's just not really in the training data that they've seen. And so thinking about how to adapt models to do that stuff. The clustering methods, it's not so much of an issue, because if the data is well clusterable, then that's going to be kind of trivial. But I think there's questions around what are the right metrics for the kind of improving of the models, because we're relying on unsupervised metrics, and so that's kind of a challenge. So maybe there's if you wanted to practically solve this problem, maybe you'd allow the human to interact a bit more and kind of give some kind of high-level feedback about whether it's going in the right direction or not. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question on the last part of the automatic scientist. As you were mentioning, there is many biases in the dataset, in the images, and I was wondering if you try in the design of the statistic computation to correct it, or if you let the LLM do the job, being aware that there should be biases and he has to care about it, and if it's you are in the second part, did he do something against this bias or not?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very cool question. You could think abstracting that out to a high level. You might think there's some measurement noise in my system that's part of the data I collected, and as a result, it won't reflect reality. So could you provide that model to the discovery agent, or could you allow the discovery agent to infer something about that model? I think that's really exciting. I guess thinking about how you would do that in practice, then somehow you need to have some other grounded data or unbiased data, and so maybe there's some way that could work, but not something we've thought about, but I think there's some cool opportunities there. Yep, thank you.
Other question? I have a quick, simple one. Like you mentioned, 5 million annotated images.
Yeah.
Who was doing that, and how many people were in charge of that?
Yes, very patient annotator. So I kind of hid the details, but there's a bit of a trick there, because if the query was about a hermit crab using plastic waste as its shell, we can, because on iNaturalist the subset of images we've collected or used, they already have the species labeled, we can immediately